Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, you can win at RPGs. Most RPG channels will talk about player agency, the notion that everyone around the table has some ability to influence the direction, the nature, and the tone of the RPG campaign. Today, I want to talk to you about something a little more complicated. That is character agency. And I want to talk to you about it because I think understanding character agency may be the key that helps you unlock how to implement one-to-one time and downtime operations in your RPG campaign. Of course, mostly I talk about Dungeons & Dragons, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, but in this case it really applies to any RPG that you care to name. So what are we talking about when we talk about character agency? There's this idea out there in RPG land that if you're not actively piloting your character, that it collapses. It just falls limp to the ground like a marionette whose strings have been cut, and that is the wrong attitude to take. This is a perfectly serviceable way to play the game, that every moment of that character's day, you dictate what that character is doing. However, does that ever really happen? Not really. Even in the most conventional of campaigns, you find yourself scaling back the amount of control, direct control, you have over that character. For the purposes of today's discussion, I want you to imagine that your character has a little dial or a slider that goes from 0 to 100. And when the dial is cranked all the way to 0, that means the character is not actively engaged at all. It's the proverbial marionette with the strings cut. Crank it to 100, and you have absolute total control over every single thing that character does. You never really spend time at 100%. That would mean dictating which pinky is moved, which muscle fibers twitch. Nobody really manages a character to that degree. There's always a degree of trust between the player and the dungeon master that you don't have to do that. A classic example would be when you're walking down the halls of a corridor. You're in a dungeon, it's a dangerous environment, and you tell the dungeon master, my character walks down the 30-foot corridor. Now, there's a couple of different ways to do that. If we turn the dial to about 50%, your character simply strides down the hallway with no concerns whatsoever. But if you are concerned about traps in that hallway that might catch your character unawares, you may turn that dial from 50 up to 75. And now the directions that you give your dungeon master are a little more specific. You're taking a little more control, and you're exercising a little bit more agency over the actions of that character. You would inform the dungeon master that my character will be raising the torch up high and checking the ceiling for any potential openings for threats. My character is looking at the floor. Are any of the flagstones a different color? Is there mortar surrounding them? Are there any gaps or spots in the walls that I think might hide some kind of danger, a blade trap or a dart trap? Now you're specifically indicating what parts of the hallway your character is looking at, and you've turned the dial up to about 75. The same thing applies in combat. In modern day iterations, 3rd edition, 5th edition, combat is broken down in 6-second combat rounds. You dictate each and every swing of your sword. In a game like Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, that dial is turned way down. It's a 1-minute combat round. I'm not worried about each and every swing of the sword, every block of the shield. I just need to know that during this minute, I'm on the offensive. I'm looking for an opening and I'm attacking. You see, we've turned down the agency. This is a really detailed look at what's going on in the game, and of course, there's always some back and forth, some trust between the player and the dungeon master. Well, wouldn't I have recognized this danger? I mean, there's a loss of fidelity between what the dungeon master describes and what the player pictures in his mind, and we often retcon. Oh, I didn't realize they were that far away. Can I take that back and shoot my bow instead of charging? Yeah, sure, that's fine, because we had a miscommunication. The orders you gave were baked into some assumptions. And of course, we frequently say, well, wouldn't my character have known? Wouldn't my character have made different decisions based upon the sensory environment in which he found himself that I'm not in? I'm sitting at a table with Cheeto stains on my fingers. My character is not. He's aware of things that I'm not. He has an agency outside of my actions. So I think you understand with these simple little examples what we mean by agency and how we have to be cool, man, how we have to trust each other, and how we have to better communicate what's going on. Well, what does all this have to do with downtime? And the answer is that when you step away from the table and when you seek to implement downtime orders, all you're doing is taking that dial and turning it from 50 way down to about a 10. And again, perhaps an example is the best way to illustrate what we're talking about here. What if people will exclaim, we're playing one-to-one time, and I'm out, my character is out on an expedition. I have purchased a week's worth of rations for him, but we couldn't get together to play the campaign for 3 weeks. Obviously, my character runs out of food after 1 week, and when we pick the game back up after 2 weeks of having no food, my character is very weak. He has starved to death. This is not the right way to think about downtime orders. And it should be pretty obvious why. Your character has an agency all on his own. He's not simply going to lay down by the fire when he runs out of food and be hungry all of the time. Instead, he's going to take active steps to procure more food for himself. So this is what happens when you have a downtime that stretches beyond what you were aware of. You may have to retcon the last 2 weeks. I thought we were going to get together on Friday, but Joe got sick, and then Bill had an issue, and work was crazy. So now we come back 3 weeks later and say, well, I thought it was going to be a week. Turns out it was 3. So what did we do during those 2 weeks? What was my character doing? And there's a little bit of leeway that you as a player have to dictate that. Obviously, he's not going to sit there and starve. He would go out and he would hunt and he would secure additional food. He would gather berries. He would go fishing in the stream. The 2 weeks at which you did not game, at which you weren't at the table micromanaging every decision, you can trust your character to live a life of his own and make good decisions. Now, because we've turned the agency dial down to 10, you still want the control over your character's decision. You still, as the player, want the agency to determine what strategies he is implementing. So in the case of a dungeon delve where it's too far to head back to town, you might set up a camp and you would give your dungeon master orders for the downtime. Listen, while we're out and away from the table, out in the real world, living our lives and exercising our agency, my character is going to fulfill his hierarchy of needs. He's going to be gathering fuel to stay warm. He's going to be gathering food to stay fed. He is going to, well, if that's all done and he's got time left on his hands, he's got some options. I, as the dungeon master, might ask you, do you want to increase the defensibility of your camp? You're only 2 miles from the dungeon entrance. You could start to work on a log palisade. Maybe you want to hide your camp. Maybe you'll take an extra hour a day to move camp every night so that no one can ambush you. They can't find it. It'll make it harder for wandering monsters to encounter you. Maybe you decide, if I've got plenty of food stocks in store, I want to go scout the dungeon entrance. I'm going to spend an hour a day just watching at sunset to see who comes in and who leaves. This is what my character was doing over the previous 2 weeks, and now as we sit down to the next session, you have increased your knowledge about the world in which your character lives. You have implemented strategies, you have dictated, and in a way, you've defined the kind of character you have. If your character is very bold and aggressive, then he is far more likely to build a defensible structure. If he is somewhat timid and risk-averse, he may decide, I'm going to hide, I'm going to increase camouflage, I'm going to look for a more defensible natural campsite in which to stay. I am going to look for any potential allies in the area. If I encounter any hobbits, halflings, elves, can I ask them for intel? Can I perhaps bribe them for intel? There are things that happen in those 2 weeks, and this is where the beauty of downtime operations occurs. You don't have to do this at the table. You can pick up the phone and call your player if you're the dungeon master and say, hey, you know what? Your guy has been hunting and he actually ran into some elves. How does he want to deal with them? Is he going to take a hostile approach? Is he going to try to bribe them? Real easy. Maybe just a direct message on one of the social media apps. In this way, you can turn that dial from 10% up a little bit higher, maybe to 20%. Yeah, I'm going to talk to him and try to befriend him. That's all you have to say. And then when you come back and you sit down at the table, or you get an email back from your dungeon master saying they were very warm and receptive to your friendship and they give you some additional food, a little bit of lembas, and they give you some information about who's coming and going. Now, can you trust them? There's an opportunity for role-playing here in the downtime. And you don't have to worry about every single word that your character says. You can just say, I try to befriend them. You can turn that dial as high as you want during downtime. I've had some of my best role-playing experiences conducted via chat, via text message, back and forth between me and another player in character. It was delightful. And when we sat down for the next session, we had a whole backstory worked out that we had to explain to the dungeon master what happened, what we discussed, and why. In this case, there would have been combat, but my character was so thoroughly dominated by the other character that he basically was being held hostage. And he became a servant of the other character, a reluctant ally, if you will, during downtime. This could not have happened if you did not use one-to-one timekeeping and downtime orders. If you don't trust your fellow players enough to engage in this style of play, then you are really cutting off a huge wealth of potential experiences and ways to explore these wonderful role-playing games. Don't think about your character as an avatar whose skin you step into and who lacks all agency. Think of them as a character, a living being in his own right, that you can adjust how much control you have over his individual actions. And honestly, this makes a lot of sense because the same thing happens before your character takes his first breath in the campaign. When you roll up your character and you decide what those stats mean, when you write a backstory for the character, you are giving downtime orders for his entire life up to the start of the campaign. Just because you started the campaign doesn't mean you have to stop treating your character as a living, breathing creature. All of that backstory can be now story if you allow for the implementation of one-to-one time. And I think you'll find that allowing your character to have more agency of his own will allow you as the player to exercise more agency in that campaign. Think about this the next time you sit down and play. Exactly where is my dial set? How concerned am I about micromanaging this character right now? Sometimes you want to turn it all the way up, sometimes you want to turn it down. And there's no right answer for where that dial is set, but there is an answer, and you should be more proactive and more conscious and aware of where you're turning that agency dial, whether you're sitting at the table or stuck in traffic texting with your DM, or at your desk emailing your DM the weekly orders for downtime. Your characters have a full, rich, and often dangerous life, even when you don't climb into their skulls and pull every individual lever to control them. Quick one today, I know, little something to think about. Good gaming, guys. Till next time, I'm praying for you.